So welcome to another video. Today it is the sewing guide for the Annette satchel handbag. Now I have made a few changes which you will have seen in the cutting guide, which went out yesterday or is available in the Annette sew along on my channel if you're watching this in the future. Hello future! I have just put in this recess zipper because I prefer the sewing experience and I also prefer the look rather than the zip that goes along the top of the bag. I have made 6 of these now. This is definitely my favourite out of those 6. So let me show you how I put this together. As ever, I am doing things backwards, but I much prefer to sew my handles and my shoulder strap at the very beginning so that it's not something I have to do once the entire bag is finished, and then you have to do these to then add them on to then actually properly finish the bag. I'm actually using the strap ends that are 3/4 of an inch wide, so I have cut my handles down to 3 inches wide by 18 inches long. These are basically an inch less wide than the pattern recommends, and that's just because that is the hardware that I happen to have in stock. I think that you can have either the inch wide or the 3/4 inch wide straps going through these long john anchors. I don't think it looks bad with the 1 inch ones, but the 3/4 inch ones do fit in slightly snugger to this area, so that's just something to bear in mind. So the first thing that we want to do is mark the center of our handle, which is for me 1.5 inches because mine are 3 inches wide. Yeah, I can see that. If your straps are 4 inches wide still, then you need to make a mark at the 2 inch point down the length of your handle. So this is the time where your double-sided tape would come into play. I have run out. The video that you saw, the cutting guide video, was filmed just before the retreat and I have literally run out and I haven't got any more in stock. So I am going to do this the harder way. That you can do it this way. The double-sided tape just makes it slightly easier. If you have double-sided tape, you can run, depending on the width of it, you can run it down the center and fold the raw edges into meet, or if you have a narrower tape you can run it along the edges and then fold those in to meet the line that you've just drawn. As I mentioned, only have Wonder Clips, so I'm going to use my Wonder Clips. In fact, I'm using my mum's Wonder Clips because mine seem to have disappeared. I have like 4, so I'm going to fold over the raw long edge to that line that we have just drawn down the middle of the handle, and I'm going to do that the whole way along. Okay, so once they're all clipped one side, you then want to fold the other side over to the middle, and you can either clip this as well or you can then fold it again so that the folded edges meet and move the Wonder Clip over so that you have got everything clipped into place. You want to be as precise as possible with the folding because you want to make sure that your straps are coming out nice and evenly. Okay, so once you've got your strap looking something like this, even if you are using double-sided tape, I would highly recommend you clip it into place because the double-sided tapes that I've had in the past have not stuck things down as permanently as you maybe would like. They are a temporary solution until you can get it under the sewing machine. So the first thing we're going to do is run a line of top stitching along this edge so that we can secure everything in place, and once that's done you're going to run a line of top stitching along the other edge to balance things out and make it look even. You want to practice your top stitching on a spare bit of faux leather before you commit to doing your handles. I personally like a 4.5 stitch length for the faux leather. When you're doing your practice swatch, you want to make sure that you're going through the same amount of layers as that you will be sewing. So this is 4 layers in total. And as I say, I like a 4.5 for mine. I don't use a top stitching thread, but you totally can. I also chicken out of using top stitching thread that is a contrasting colour, but a cream top stitching thread with this tan moire would look amazing. I'm using a matching one because I just prefer the leeway that that gives me. So I'm going to get this top stitch both sides. I'm going to do the same for the other handle. I'm also going to do the same for my shoulder strap, which is still remaining 4 inches wide, so the center line on this one will be 2 inches. Fold the raw edges into the middle, fold it again and top stitch. For top stitching, I'm going to use my blind hem foot or edge stitch foot, which is one of the feet that I talked to you about in the cutting guide. Let's get all that done. I have straps and handles. I am going to show you how to make your strap into an adjustable strap next. Okay, now that you have sewn your shoulder strap, we're going to need our strap slider. We're going to need our strap ends. These are the 1-inch ends for the 1-inch wide shoulder strap, and you're also going to need your 1-inch swivel clasps. I like to keep the plastic bags that these come in if they are the resealable type for my buttons, and I use them in my button stash. I'll put like a label on saying how many buttons are in there. I just find that it keeps selections of buttons together. Don't take the little screws out of the plastic baggie until you're ready to screw them into place though. Just ask me how I know. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is put on our strap slider. So you're going to feed the end of the strap through and then back on itself, and you don't want to give it too much length. You want enough coming out of here so that you can easily access this to put on the strap end in a second. But the first thing that you want to do is punch a hole through the center of this close to the strap slider for a rivet. I'm using 9mm medium rivets, trying to get it to click. Come on. I'm going to squish it in a second. So we have the strap slider and we have the raw edge. This is the wrong side, this is the right side. So you want to feed on to the end that's got nothing on it at the moment, one of your swivel clasps, with the swivel clasp facing upwards on the right side. So it should be in this kind of alignment. You should see the top of the swivel clasp and you should see the right side of the strap. You can turn it over. You're going to take the other end of your strap and feed it back through the strap slider, and it will fit. You want it to be a snug fit so that it doesn't kind of move when you don't want it to move when you're using the bag. So you're going to feed that through. My long nails are being detrimental. Right, there we go. Right, okay, so we are feeding the strap back through the strap slider. So you should end up with the wrong or the raw edge on the inside of the loop. So it should look like this. And then we're going to take the second swivel clasp, and again, so we've got this right side up, and you're going to put the swivel clasp on like that. We're going to do the same thing. We need to be able to put our strap end on here, so we've got like an inch folded under there. I am going to put a rivet in to hold it in place. I am eyeballing the rivets, but you can totally measure if you would like to. Okay. Click my little rivet into place. Now I'm going to squish my rivets and then we can put on our strap ends. Okay, one thing you want to be careful of when you are squishing your rivets is that you make sure that the die covers and goes around, doesn't kind of cut through the center of one of the rivets, because when you put pressure on it, it can totally dent the rivet, which you don't want. So there's one done. Bit of a tight fit in there, but we are in. There's the second one done. So next up we are going to need the little teeny tiny screwdrivers. And again, with this you want to be really careful with these screws. You do not want to get more screws out of their little baggie before you need them. Ask me how I know. I do have some spares of these if I manage to lose one though. Fingers crossed I won't. So there's kind of like a right and a wrong side to these strap ends. This is being the wrong side, that being the right side. So I'm just gonna trim that end just to get rid of any of the little floofy bits, and I'm going to slide on. Now you can totally use E6000 for this. I have found that it's not technically necessary, Oh, my battery's dying, 2 secs. I have just slid my strap end on. I'm going to take one of the little grub screws and fingers crossed I've picked the right screw. No, got too big. Got to have just the right size. There we go, and you want to make sure that you're going at the right angle as well. So screw that in nice and tightly, and that will dig into the more leather or the fabric to finish it off. If you are using fabric, you don't have to use these strap ends. You could totally turn the ends under when you are making your straps. But I just love this finish for the faux leather, because turning the faux leather under ends up very, very bulky. Ask me how I know. So that's one strap end done. I'm just going to finish off this one in the same manner, then we can move on to the next step. As I mentioned, I very rarely follow the order of instructions that the pattern would ask you to do things in. I like sewing my lining first. I just like having that ready to put into the outer when the bag outer is done. And it also, if it's a new to you pattern, the lining, not always, but a lot of the time, the lining can be the same as the bag outer. So it's a good way to kind of practice things on something that's not going to be quite so visible right from the get-go. This is the elasticated pocket, just in case. I think I've gone through the measurements for this, but it's 13 inches at the top, 9 inches at the bottom, 5 inches tall, and trapezoid in shape. And again, I think I have that name right. So I have cut mine out of some Michael Miller Fairy Frost and interfaced it. The first thing that we need to do is fold the short ends under by 1/2 inch, because the seam allowance for this pattern is 1/2 inch, so I maintained that for the piece that I have drawn. If you have problems eyeballing 1/2 inch, what you can do is draw a line 1 inch away from the raw edge, and then if you fold the raw edge up to that line, you have then, and press it, you will have pressed an exact 1/2 inch seam allowance under. So I have literally taken my ruler and my friction pen. Bear in mind we are going to be ironing this, so friction pen might not be the best bet, but you draw a line 1 inch away from the raw edge, and then you take the raw edge and you fold the raw edge to meet the line that you've just drawn, and that will give you a nice accurate press for your 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we're going to be pressing under the seam short ends on all 4 pieces. So you should end up with 2 pieces that look like this. So we've got the edges folded under. There are going to be little ears on the top there, so you can trim those off now, or you can trim them off once you've sewn the pieces. Right, so now that I have trimmed off those excess seam allowances, we're going to put this right sides together, and with the folded edges folded under, we are going to pin this together, and you're going to sew along the top and bottom edge at 1/2 inch. So we're going to sew along the bottom edge and the top edge at 1/2 inch, and once that's done you want to turn it through and press it so everything is nice and flat. Okay, so you should end up with something that looks like this, and it is a complete tube because you have left the 2 turned under folded edges loose. Gosh, words really are hard this week. So we're going to turn this through, and once it's all turned through, I'm going to go and press these seams flat. So the top and the bottom seam, press them flat. Okay, so now that it's pressed flat, you'll notice that we have more little ears that need trimming. So I like to trim those off like that. I'm going to do that on both sides. Okay. So the next thing that we want to do is top stitch along this top edge 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge, and then you're going to do a second line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from that. And for my fabric I'm using a top stitching length of 3.5 because I like how that looks. If you're going to get confused with all the different top stitching lengths, it's a good idea to write them on a post-it note and stick them to the side of your machine, especially if this will take you a couple of days to make your bag. So far I'm using 4.5 for my faux leather, 3.5 for the fabric, and then 2 2.5 construction stitch for everything else. Okay, so with the top stitching you should end up with something like this. So the next thing that we need to do is find the center of our piece. So the bottom edge should measure 8.5 inches, which means the center is going to be 4.25 inches. So I've made the mark, and then I'm just squaring off the bottom of my ruler, and I've made a mark up through the center, and that's going to be important for later. The next thing we want to do is take our 1/4 inch elastic, and we are going to make a mark 7 inches in from the elastic, and I like to keep it on the reel for reasons that I will show you now. I'm going to take my purple thang. There is a little hole in the purple thang. Feed the elastic through that, quite a lot of elastic, and we want to put the purple thing in through the channel that we have sewn and hope that it's not too tight. It should go through, fingers crossed. I don't want to have to unpick this. There we go. So just a little bit of kind of like wiggling. If your fabric isn't quite as thick as mine, this will be a little bit easier. I promise it will go through. There we go. To try and make sure that you don't catch the folded under seam allowance when you get to the end. There we go. See? Doable, just a bit tight. So we now have our internal pocket on a really long piece of elastic. So what we're going to do next is make sure that, you know, that 7-inch mark that we did earlier, we're going to make sure that that is visible on both sides of the elastic, like that. So now pull the elastic back carefully, because you don't want it to go all the way through. Ask me how I know. I'm going to pull it back till we get the elastic flush with the edge of the channel, and we're going to sew backwards and forwards 3 times over the elastic just to secure that into place. I'm going to pull a little bit out because of the way that I like to finish this off. So there's a little bit of the elastic showing there, so I'm going to secure that into place. Now this is sometimes something that you may need to do with some help. So you can see that there's a little bit of the elastic poking out of the end there. You want to pull on that elastic, and this is why you might need an extra pair of hands. Pull on the elastic and then cut close to it, so that you're cutting off a tiny little bit like that. But that means that the excess elastic snaps back into the channel so that there's none hanging out of the edge. Now here's hopefully the clever part. You want to bring the rest of the elastic through the channel until you get to the mark that you've made. Now this fabric is actually kind of stiff. It's a quilting cotton, but I have interfaced it, so I'm actually going to do mine at 6 inches, but I'd rather, you know, try it this way and be able to judge that, because we want the top of this pocket to kind of be gathered in a little bit like that. So you're going to take the mark that you've made, as I said, mine's now 6 inches, and you're going to line that up with the edge of the pocket piece, and you're going to backstitch over this, much like you did with the starting piece over here. That's to secure the elastic in place, and then you can cut it off the reel. Okay. I'm going to trim off the threads and then do the same thing that we did on the other side. So again, it is possible to do it by yourself, but it is easier if you've got somebody else helping you. So going to kind of hold the piece down with my hand, pull the elastic and cut off the excess, which makes the elastic kind of ping back into itself. So you should end up with something that looks a little bit like that, which is going to be our pocket. So now I'm going to get one of the lining pieces, and this is the bottom lining piece that you want. You want one of them for now. And we're working with a 1/2 inch seam allowance with this pattern, so you want to find the center of the piece. So I'm going to do that by finger pressing. There's my center, and again I'm using a friction pen, and the bottom edge of this is 8.25, so sorry, 8.5. So we want to make a mark 1.5 inches up from the bottom edge and 4.25 inches to either side of the central point. Okay, so we've got our central point here, and I am going to just draw a line in so that it can help me match up this. So we drew the center line in earlier, so we're going to match up that center line with the center line that we've just drawn on the pattern piece. And you want to kind of stretch this out so that the bottom edge kind of goes along that line that you've just drawn. It will curve up to at the sides. Doesn't have to. You can be a little bit, you know, like you can make it sit flat, but as long as you maintain your 1/2 inch seam allowance on these side panels here when you sew this in, because we're going to top stitch all around in a U shape. So if you're worried about hitting your seam allowances, you can draw them in. As I mentioned, this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this pattern, so I'm going to draw those in on both sides. And again, this is a friction pen that comes away with heat, so we want to start at this end, and we're going to back stitch and we're going to top stitch all the way around in a U shape to secure this pocket piece into place. Okay, so you should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Don't worry that it's kind of puckering the lining piece. That's totally fine. We can sort that out later. When the bag's actually sewn, it will all lie flat. So the last thing that we need to do is top stitch along this center line that we drew earlier. You want to try and sort of evenly distribute the elastic that we put in to make sure that it's even on both sides. This is where that center line on the lining piece comes into place, so you can match up the top and the bottom, and we're just going to top stitch that into place to give us 2 interior elasticated pockets. Okay, so everything is top stitched into place, and these do fit the iPhone 10 Plus. I don't know about other phones, but it does fit this one in just. I'm going to put this to the side, and going to need our second lining, bottom lining piece. We're going to need our zipper facing and our 2 pocket panels and your 8-inch or 20cm zip. I'm using a continuous zip tape with the added little zipper pulls in there, so I will cut my zipper to be the appropriate length when I need it. So the first things that we're going to do on the back of this piece, we're going to find the center, so just sort of finger press that into place, mark it, got the center there. Then I'm going to measure down. Then I'm going to measure down 2 inches from that top edge. In fact, I'm going to go for 2.5 inches. So there's the 1/2 inch, right? So we're 2.5 inches down from the top edge. We're going to draw a line that is 8 inches in total and 4 inches either side of the center of the piece that we've marked. You want to draw another line 1/2 inch down from that, centered the same way, and going to make a little box. You want to draw a line in the middle of that box, so 1/4 inch, and you're going to draw a line 1/2 inch in from each of the short ends, and then you want to do diagonal lines to the corners of that box that we've drawn. So you want to end up with something like that. So it's 2.5 inches down from the top edge. Again, this is very different than the pattern because I have changed the interior to have a recess zip, and I'm doing it this far down. You could do it further up if you want with a shorter zip, but you want to bear in mind that we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance to take into account. So we don't want our zipper pocket to interfere with our stitching lines. So we're close, but it should be fine. It's worked very well for the other couple of bags like this that I have made. So once you've drawn that line in, you then want to take your zipper facing piece, which is 11 by 3 inches. That is bigger than you need it to be, but I prefer to work with larger and cut away than work with exactly the right size and struggle to get it to fit in. So we want to put this right side up and then put the lining piece so it's the right sides together, and we're kind of centering this box here over our facing piece. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins into the facing piece just to help me stitch it, and we are going to stitch around this box. You're going to start in the middle and you're going to back stitch, and you're going to sew all the way along to this 1/2 inch piece. I want you to reduce your stitch length to 1.5. You're going to sew up to the corner but not directly on the corner. Take one tiny diagonal stitch across the corner, sew down here, tiny diagonal stitch across the corner, and then back to the 1 inch mark at the 1/2 inch mark, which is where this point comes here. Put your stitch length back up to 2.5 and go all the way to the other side and do the same thing. So if you want to mark it in so that you've got like an accurate place to stop, you can draw yourself a line like this. So once you hit that line, you're going to reduce your stitch length to 1.5, sew up to the corner but not directly onto the point of the corner, stitch one tiny stitch across the point of the corner, same around there, and then back to here where you started and back stitch. So I'm going to get that done and show you what it looks like. And we have the right side of our facing to the right side of our lining. Okay, so it's probably not going to be super obvious, but I have done what I said, and we've got the little diagonal stitches at the corners. So now we need to do the scary thing and cut into our envelope, because we are creating a welt for the zip to live in. So I like to fold it in half and cut through the center, and we're cutting along that center line, that 1/4 of an inch away from either side, so the center line of the envelope that we have just sewn. So you're going to cut along that until you get to those diagonal lines, and you're going to cut up to and as close as you can to the corners without cutting through any of the stitching, being really careful. This is where it helps if you have scissors that are sharp to the point. These are my Kai N5135 L19. They will be listed in the description down below. So I'm going to do the same for both sides. So you want to post your fabric through. Now I find that if I post through the short edges first and really kind of like finger press those into place like that, that it then helps me to post through the rest of the fabric to then get everything to lie nice and flatly. Now you don't want to try and get everything to lie flatly and then iron it all in one go. What I am going to do is I am going to iron these short ends flat first, and then I'll iron one of these edges, then I'll iron the other edge. So I'm, doing the short edges first, then the longer ones, and that should help me to get everything to lie nice and flatly. So once everything is pressed, you should end up with a nice window like that. Don't worry that the excess of the facing is hanging over the edge, totally fine, but this is why I prefer to work with slightly bigger pieces so I can trim away the excess later, rather than fussing and trying to make the thing fit. I just prefer to trim later. So we're going to put this to the side for now, and we're going to take our pocket panels. These are 9 inches by 7 inches, and there should be 2 of them. So we're also going to need our zip. So the opening that we've made is 8 inches long, so I'm going to cut my zip to be 9 inches long. If you have like a metal zip that is 8 inches, you'll notice that the actual tape on either side will make the entire length of the zip itself to be 9 inches. The metal zip part is the 8-inch part, and that's what's going to fit into this envelope. So I'm going to make myself a 9-inch zip with this zipper tape, and I'm going to do that off camera. There are some brilliant tutorials for getting your zipper pulls to get onto your zipper tape. I am not an expert at it, I struggle, so I'm going to do it off camera, but I will try and link some of the tutorials in the description down below for you. So I have my 9-inch zip. I have backstitched at both ends to make sure that the zipper pull doesn't fly off, and before you do that, make sure you put the zipper pull on. Again, ask me how I know. So this is going to feel really, really wrong and not the right way around to do this. You want to put the wrong side of the zip to the right side of the fabric along the top edge, and we are going to stitch that in place close to this edge, bearing in mind that we are going to be centering this zip in a 1/2 inch wide window, and we don't want this stitching to show. So we are going to reinforce this stitching when we top stitch it later. You want to bear in mind when you are putting this bit on that we don't want this stitching securing this to the fabric to actually show. So I'm using Wonder Clips because I actually think that if you pin this, it can distort things, which I am not a huge fan of. I am going to sew, I'm going to backstitch, and I'm going to sew like a scant 1/4 of an inch, so just under a 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge. I'm going to use a proper zipper foot. When my zipper pull gets into the way, I'm going to keep my needle down, raise the foot up, move the pull out of the way, and finish off the line of stitching. So put the wrong side of the zip to the right side of the fabric, and I promise that's the right way around. Okay, so I've got that stitched into place. So we're going to take the second pocket panel piece. If your fabric is directional, you want, so I mean the leaves are kind of growing up, so this is the top, this is the bottom. If your fabric is directional, you want to be sewing your zip to the top, or so that the zip is at the top of your print as you look at it, with this being the bottom and then this being the print going that way. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to take our zip and we're going to put the wrong side of the zip to the right side of the fabric, so that the right sides of the fabric are together, and we're going to sew this side of the zip in place, much like we've just done with this one. Then we're going to go and press. So hopefully once you've pressed this, you should end up with something that looks like this. So the right side of the zip should be on the wrong side of the fabric, and the right side of the fabric should have the back side of the zip. So we'll put that to the side or on my lap for now, and bring back the lining piece with the envelope window in it. I have stolen some of Mum's tape, and I'm going to put the tape along the top and bottom of this window. This is one piece that you really don't want to pin or kind of not use tape. This is why the tape is essential. You can do this without it, but I just find it a lot easier. So I like to use the edge of my purple thing to kind of burnish that into place, and you want to leave the backing tape on because you're going to put your zip down, and we're going to center our envelope over our zip. And once you're happy with the placement, so we're too far that way and not enough that way, move that over a little bit. So these teeth on this are plastic as well, so you can sew through these, which is why this zipper on a yard, or zipper by the yard, is brilliant. So you want to center your zip so you've got a decent amount either side. And then what I like to do is remove one of the tape backings. So I'm going to remove the bottom tape backing if I can. Always fun to try and peel this off. Okay. I'm going to do it so that I can see it better, because I don't want to get this wonky. So you want to see an even amount of the zipper tape, and if you look at the zipper tape, it has kind of got like lines in it, so I am making sure that the lines are all matched up, and then pressing down on the tape to get that into place. Then I'll peel this back and take off my second layer of tape so that I can then position the top edge so that everything matches up nicely. And once I'm happy with the position of my window and my zip, I am going to top stitch around this window. I'm going to start in the bottom here, and I don't want to back stitch. I'm going to leave myself a nice long thread tail. I'm going to top stitch all the way around, and again, not back stitch at the end, but leave a long thread tail. And once I have taken this work out from underneath the machine, I will then thread those tails onto a hand sewing needle, post them through and tie them in a knot to finish them off nicely. So I'm going to get that done. Okay, so I've top stitched all around, and I have left myself my long thread tails. So I'm going to post those back through. You only want to go through the lining fabrics, you don't want to go into the pocket. So coming through the middle of my fabric sandwich, as it were, if I could thread my needle, post those through, tie those in a knot, then tie the other side in a knot as well, trim off the excess. Right, so now we should have something that looks like this, and when you open up your zip, you have a nicely finished and enclosed zipper, raw zipper edge. That's why we've done the facing. So you've probably noticed that we've got one pocket panel longer than the other pocket panel. So when you look at it, we've got the top one that's sewn to the top of the zip, which is shorter than the bottom one. So you need to press this up by 1/2 inch. And once you've pressed the top edge, the top one up by 1/2 inch, you then press up the bottom one by however much, so that you end up with even folded edges. So the bottom one's getting pressed up by what looks like 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, and then we will be sewing up the side seams of our pocket pieces. So just to show you that again, this is the top. We've got the top of the zip, the upper panel. We're going to press that back by 1/2 inch. The underneath panel, the one that's closest to the lining panel, the large lining panel piece of the bag, that one's going to get pressed up to meet that edge like that, and then we will sew the side seams. So I have pressed up my edges. Now obviously you could trim this beforehand. Lots of people do tell you to do that. I've done it in the past, and I find it incredibly easy to get things in upside down, and I end up with the trimmed piece on top, which is not what you want. So I prefer just to do it this way. So the next thing we need to do is sew up the side seams of our internal pocket. We have important triangles. So when you peel back the outer layer, you will end up with those little triangles here that we snipped in earlier when we were doing our envelope. These are our important triangles. So when we're sewing our side seam, we're not necessarily going for a specific seam allowance. What you want to do is get as close to this triangle as possible and stitch over it without catching any of the lining fabric, and you want to do the same for both sides. And you want to sew it with the folded edges up like that, so that you've got the nice folded edge down at the bottom here for when we finish the bag later. So important triangles, that is the seam allowance that you want to be aiming for, as close to the edge of this without catching any of the lining fabric. So we should end up with something that looks like this, and sewn over the important triangles. So you can now trim off the excess of the facing, which I'm going to do, and then we can start putting in our zipper plackets so that we can start constructing our lining. So next up, we're going to need our zipper placket pieces. There should be 4 of those, and our 16-inch or longer zip. I am again going to be using the continuous zipper by the yard. I actually don't put my zipper pull on this until right at the end. I find it much easier. So I'm going to put this to the side for now, and we're going to use our zipper placket pieces. So what we need to do for these, we should have 4 of these. Yours should be interfaced, and we are going to turn all of the short ends under by 1/2 inch. I'm going to do the same trick that I did last time. I'm going to mark a line 1 inch away from the raw edge on the short edge of all 4 of these pieces, and we're going to do it for both sides. Okay, so again, you're taking the raw edge and you're meeting the raw edge up with the line that you have just drawn in, and again finger pressing that into place, and then we're actually going to go and properly press it into place in a second. So I'm going to do the same for all 4 pieces. So I'm going to get all of these pressed and then we'll show you what to do next. So you should end up with 4 pieces that have their ends folded under like this. They don't want to behave themselves, but yes, there we go. So all the ends are folded under. Right, so the next thing we want to do is pull our zipper apart, and we are going to need to kind of finish off one of the edges. You want to kind of fold it back on itself so it's at a right angle. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that. So you kind of fold it under like that so it's at a right angle. I'm going to hand stitch that into place, and I'm going to do the same I'm going to do the same for both ends, and that will just give me a nice finished edge on my placket. So like I say, you take it and you kind of fold it back on itself so that the zipper coil ends up at a right angle, and then we're going to hand stitch that into place so it stays in place and just makes it easier to handle when we are attaching it to this. Technically you could pin or clip this if you want to, but just putting a couple of hand stitches in will make working with this a lot easier. You want to make sure that you're doing it to the same end as well, by the way. That is important. Now that I've got those ends kind of curled back on themselves, what I'm going to do is take one of my placket pieces and I'm going to take one of my zips. So we're going to place it with the wrong side of the zip to the right side of the placket. You're going to line up the kind of curved edge here with the folded edge that we've pressed into place, and we're going to stitch this into place at 1/4 of an inch all the way along. You're going to make sure that you keep your folded edges folded under. We want this nice folded edge to be our finished edge. So we're going to do that for this first one, and again I'm going to use my wonder clips to keep this in place and my regular zipper foot to sew this. So you should end up with something that looks like this. So the next thing we're going to do is make a zipper sandwich. So you're going to place another of your placket pieces over the piece that you've just made, so the right sides are together and the zip is sandwiched in between, and you're going to sew from the side where you can see the stitching, and you're going to go over the stitching that you've just done to secure the zip in place. Now technically you could do this all in one pass. I prefer to do it in 2 passes just because I find that I get a more accurate result when I do it this way. So I'm going to again use wonder clips, pin this in place, and then stitch over this previous line of stitching to secure the second placket into place. So you should end up with something that looks like this, and you're going to go and press the fabric away from the zipper tape, and I like to press one side first and then I'll turn it over and press the other side, and I find I just get a much cleaner press that way. And we need to repeat all of this for the other side of our zipper tape. So I'm going to get that done and then I'll show you what we do next. So we should end up with 2 things that look like this. So that's the right side of the zip up with long tails that we will finish later when we put the pull on. So the next thing that we need to do, and as you can see I have pressed these away from the zipper teeth, we are going to top stitch around the edges of these placket pieces. So this bit is going to get sewn into the lining. Again, I have actually made this slightly larger than I need it to, and I'm going to trim this down by probably, so I'm probably going to take off a good inch off of this. Actually, no, a good 1/2 inch off of this, because by the time I've then sewn the 1/2 inch seam allowance in, I'll end up with another sort of 1/2 inch of placket visible. But again, I prefer to work with slightly larger pieces that I trim down later rather than fiddly pieces that have to be perfect first time. So I'm going to start top stitching at this short edge here, top stitch along here, which will sew those 2 folded edges together, top stitch alongside the zipper teeth, and then back down this short edge here, which again will sew those 2 folded edges shut. And I'm going to do the same for both zipper placket pieces. So all the top stitching is done, so we now have very nice zipper sandwiches. As I mentioned, I'm going to trim off 1/2 inch from the raw edge of both of these placket pieces, because that will give me a nice finished measurement once they are sewn into the lining pieces. So I'm going to cut those off, and then we can get these sewn in to the lining piece, which will then allow us to sew the bottom lining and the side lining on and have a finished lining ready to put into our bag. Okay, so we're going to need our top lining pieces. You should have 2 of those. We're going to need our bottom lining pieces. You should have 2 of those with added pockets. We are going to make some more zipper sandwiches. Now the important thing with this is you want to make sure that you're getting your zip in the right way up. This is the right side of the zip, that's the wrong side of the zip, and you want to put the wrong side of the zip to the right side of the bottom panel, and then you're going to sandwich that with one of the upper panel pieces. Now we're going to find the center of this pocket, this panel piece, by again we're going to fold it in half, finger press and make a mark. And we want to do the same with our zipper plackets, so we're going to finger press and make a mark on both sides. And the same for our top lining piece, so again finger press and make a mark. And I'm going to make a mark on the wrong side of this one. Okay, so we have our bottom lining piece with a pocket on it, we have our zipper placket, and you want to make sure that the right side of the zipper placket is up and the wrong side is going to the right side of the lower lining piece. And you want to make sure that you are matching up those center marks that we have just found. I'm going to pin that into place, and then we're going to take our upper piece and we're going to use the longer edge. So you can see there is this shorter edge, it's kind of a trapezoid shape again. So this longer edge is what gets sewn in next, and again we're going to match up that center mark and pin that into place. And once that's all pinned, you then want to pin both sides like this. And if we drafted this right earlier, then this should all match up. Just make sure that all the raw edges are aligned. And then we're going to sew that at 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're going to do the same for the other side. So I'm going to get the other one pinned into place and sewn, and then I will show you what to do next. So you should end up with 2 pieces that look like this, and you should end up with the long zipper tail kind of coming away from, you know, so the folded under edges should be together and the long tails should be opposite each other, because when you put this together that means that the zip's going to work. We have a decision to make. You can either top stitch this seam that we've just sewn with the seam allowance going up towards the upper piece, and that will force the placket down, or you can stitch it with all of the seam allowance coming into the bottom lining piece. You can top stitch along this piece here, and that will force the zipper placket to sit upright in the bag. Whichever way is you prefer will work. It doesn't matter, neither is right or wrong, it just depends on what you prefer. So I'm going to stitch it with the zipper placket going up, which means all of the seam allowance is going down towards the main body of the bag, and I'm just going to top stitch along this edge 1/8 of an inch away with my top stitching length for fabric, which is 3.5, and I'm going to do the same for both pieces. Whichever way you decide is fine, as long as you do the same for both pieces. You can't do one up and one down, that won't work. So top stitching, then we can add the bottom lining piece. So top stitching is done, and as you can see that's forcing the placket to sit upright, so when this gets zipped into the bag it will again sit upright and neither is right or wrong, just whichever you prefer. I've now got my lining base and I am going to pin that into place along the bottom edge of my bottom pad, or my now complete lining pieces. And we want to sew this with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And we're sewing it with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance because we want our lining to be just ever so slightly smaller than the outer of our bag. It will help it to sit inside the bag neatly without wrinkling. So we're going to sew this long edge here at 5/8 of an inch, and then you're going to do the same for the other side. We're going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch. Once you've sewn the bottom panel on, you want to go and press these seam allowances open, and you should end up with something that looks like this. And it's starting to kind of look like a bag interior. So the next things that you want are your side panels, and we are going to find the center of our side panel, and again, literally by folding it in half and finger pressing, little mark, and you want to do the same for both sides. And then we are going to find the center of our bottom panel. So again, fold it in half, a little bit of finger pressing and mark, and then same on the other side. So the reason we've marked those center points is because we want to match them up. So once you've marked and matched up the center point, you want to pin that into place. You then want to, and you might want to just kind of tuck these zipper things into place. This is why I have not put the zipper pull on and finished my zip, because if I had, then this would just be way more awkward. So that's one of the nice things about this zipper tape by the yard. So we're going to match up the top edge of this piece, and we're going to do the same for the other side. And once you've got those three match points in, you then want to start pinning the rest of this into place, and you're going to need to ease it in around the corners. It does fit, it's been drafted very well, it all fits together, but you will need to just ease this curve in around the corner. So I'm going to get this all pinned into place, and then I'll show you how we're going to stitch in to again get a really nice fitting lining for our bag outer. I've pinned this all into place. I am going to try and sew it with the side panel face down, because around these corners is where fabric is bunching up, and I prefer to have that under the presser foot with the feed dog on this one that's flat, just because I find it easier to make sure that everything gets sewn without any tucks or puckers. So when we start stitching, we're going to start at 1/2 inch of seam allowance, and then you're going to grade out to about 5/8 of an inch, maybe 2 inches down, and sew the remainder of this seam at 5/8 of an inch until you get to about 2 inches this side, and then grade into 1/2 inch seam allowance as well. We're doing that because the top of the bag lining needs to fit the top of the bag outer perfectly, but as previously mentioned, we want the bottom of the bag to be slightly smaller than the exterior of the bag, so it sits in there nicely without any wrinkles. So I'm going to get this sewn, and then we do something very different for the other side, so I'll show you that when we come to it. One side in, second side to go. So I have actually put a couple of marks in 5 inches down from the top edge of the bag, and I've done it on both sides because, as I say, I'm going to sew with this side by the feed dogs and this side under the presser foot. So there's a mark on both sides 5 inches down from the top. So I'm going to start sewing at 1/2 inch from here, back stitch, regular construction stitch length, grading out to about 5/8 of an inch, 2 inches down from the top. Then when I get to this mark, I'm going to back stitch, keep my needle in my work, and raise my stitch length up to the longest it will do, so that I'm basically basting this bottom edge into place until I get round to the other mark. I'm going to reduce my stitch length, back stitch, and then finish off stitching to the top edge again and again with 5/8 of an inch, grading into 1/2 inch at the other side. The reason we're doing that is I find it much easier to berth my bag through the bottom hole of the lining rather than the bottom hole of the zipper pocket. This is quite a small opening, so by basting this area into place, we're going to go and press it and then take the basting stitches out. That gives us a crease and a memory of where the stitching line is for when we have to come and sew it up later, because we have to reach through this pocket to sew that into place to then sew this shut to finish the bag. And again, I will show you that when we get there. Just to recap, we are going to start at the top edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, regular stitch length, back stitch, come down to about 2 inches and grade out to a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance until we get to the mark, back stitch, raise the stitch length up to the longest it will go and baste all around this bottom edge until we get to the other mark on the other side, lower the stitch length back to construction stitch length, back stitch, carry on sewing up to the top and grade out to, or grade back into the 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top here. So I'm going to get that done and then I'll show you what it looks like. So once everything's sewn into place, you should end up with something that looks like this. So you want to press these seam allowances open. You can clip into the curves if you want to. My fabric is fraying quite a lot, so I'm not going to, but it is something that is worth bearing in mind if you are finding that you're getting a few puckers. Also, this is the inside of your bag, and if anyone's looking at the inside depth bottom corners of your bag, they are far too close. The other thing you want to do once you've pressed, you must press first, is you want to unpick your cat flap. This is your cat flap. This is where you will be birthing your bag, pulling an elephant through a cat flap, as Claire calls it. So you should end up with a bag interior that looks like this. The only thing that might be slightly different for you is that your zip might be actually finished because you're using a regular zip, not zip by the, like tape by the yard. I still haven't put the zipper pull on yet, and it is going to be the last thing that I do. But we've got the zip plackets standing upright, you've got the interior zipper pocket, and we've got the interior elasticated pocket as well, and then giant hole inside of the bag. So I am going to stop for the night at this point. The next things that we need to do is sew up the bag outer, but it is 10 o'clock, so I'm going to quit for tonight and come and finish this tomorrow morning, and fingers crossed you're seeing this tomorrow afternoon. So yes, let's move on to the bag exterior. I'm going to do some fiddly bits for the outside now. The first thing is the strap connectors. So in the pattern it tells you to cut a piece that's 1.5 inches by 5 inches long, which you then are supposed to cut in 2. My cutting guide, I said to cut a piece that was 1.5 inches by 6 inches that you were then going to cut into 2. I've since changed that, and I have put a note in the description of the cutting guide just to say that this has been changed, but I now suggest that you cut 2 pieces 1.5 inches by 5 inches rather than cut these in half. We're going to use these as a whole. I just find it easier, as I've said previously, to work with larger pieces. These are 1.5 inches wide, so I've marked the center point on these, and we are going to fold in the raw edge to that center point, and then you want to top stitch that, and I am going to use my Wonder Tape for this. So I am going to run some Wonder Tape down each of the long edges. Now, as I mentioned earlier, my Wonder Tape is not the best, so I'm going to work on one side at a time. So peel off the backing, fold the raw edge over to meet the line that you have drawn down the centre, which is 3/4 of an inch away from the raw edges. And then with the piece this side up, I want to top stitch as close to that raw edge as possible, so the top stitching when you turn it over will be in the middle of the piece. Because the Wonder Tape I use is not so great, this is just a way of securing this down and making sure that nothing comes unstuck or, you know, out of place in the sewing process. This is an extra step that isn't included in the pattern. So I am going to run the blade of my top stitching foot number 5 down the center there and top stitch close to this raw edge as possible, and I'm going to do it with the raw edge side up. That's because the bobbin stitching on my machine looks really nice. If your bobbin stitching doesn't look so good, you might want to do it from the other side, and you should be able to feel where that edge is. You can always mark it if you want to, but I'm going to do that for this edge, then fold this one in and do the same for the other 3 pieces. So I'll show you what that looks like when I'm done. So you should end up with 2 pieces that look like this. We've got stitching down the center, and that's just going to help everything stay in place when we attach this to the side panels later. But next we need to work on the foam. You should have 2 side panel foam pieces and 2 main panel foam pieces. What we need to do with these before we sew them to the outer fabric is zigzag along this top edge and these 2 little dents here, and then zigzag all along this V edge here, and that's just so that everything is compressed in this area, and when we top stitch our bag later, the foam isn't going to be too puffy and getting in the way. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch on my machine and zigzag the top edges of both the side panel and main panel pieces. All my edges have been zigzagged, so I am now going to take the side panel and the main panel so that we can attach the foam to these faux leather pieces, or if you're using fabric, to your fabric pieces. The foam is smaller than the outer panel piece, designed that way on purpose. So what you want to do, if you can see here, it's smaller at the top. So what you want to do is match up the bottom and wonder clip these pieces into place. You are going to stitch this together, you're going to baste it together. So you've got to remember that your seam allowance is 1/2 inch, so you want to be basting this at 1/4 inch, and you want to go from the top of the foam all the way around. Now, it might be better to start in the center here and go this way and up, and then come back and go this way and up that way, so that the foam doesn't distort and twist. And again, remember that you want to do this within the seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch, so you want to be basting these at 1/4 inch. That 1/4 inch stitching will come in useful later for trimming. Okay, so once you've got all your foam attached, we are going to need our side panel pieces, these strap connectors that we previously sewed, and the 2 3/4 inch D-rings. So the first thing you want to do is make a mark 1 1/4 inches down from the point of the V. I'm using my friction pen because it will come away with heat, and I'm just double checking that that is centered, and it is 6.5 in total, and this mark is at 3 1/4 inches in. So I'm going to do the same for the other side. So the mark is 1 1/4 inches down from the V and 3 1/4 inches in. Okay, so we're going to need some double-sided tape again for these pieces. So the idea is that we are putting on our strap connectors, and we've made these extra long because these will get hidden by the side pockets anyway, but you want to make them extra long so that it's easier to sew them on and then rivet them in place. So if you can see here, I've folded it, and I haven't folded it so that it's the raw edges meet in the middle. I've folded it so that the D-ring is at the top, and then we've got 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch folded over like that. So hopefully you can see this. So that's the join there. So it's a good sort of 2 inches here and then 1/2 inch there. And we're doing it because that will help to make sure that when you sew this to your side panel piece, that the join gets thoroughly sewn down and secured. I want to put a little bit of tape down the center of this piece to help hold those folds in place whilst we then attach it to the side panel. Again, I'm going to do this one at a time. Once that tape's on, you want another little piece of tape attached, and this will help it hold it onto the side panel. So we're going to take this piece, and so that you can't see the raw edges, you want to place this edge here with the D-ring centered on that mark that you made 1 1/4 inches down from the V. Before you press everything into place, you want to make sure that it is equidistant away from both sides. So I need to just move that over just a little bit. I am doing this at an angle so that you guys can see it better than I can see it. So let's just check that again. I moved it over. I'm going to do it so I can see it. 2 secs. There we go. Doing it so that I can actually see it is helpful. We are now going to sew this down, and you want to sew from the bottom around the edges to about sort of 1 inch away from the D-rings and we're going to sew a box all the way around here. Now this bottom edge is going to be covered up by the side pocket piece, so you can backstitch if you want to. Otherwise, leave yourself a nice long thread tail when you start and stop so that you can post the threads through and tie them in a knot. And we're going to do this with the top stitching length that we've been using. So for me, 4.5 for my machine and this leather combination. So I'm going to sew a rectangle around this area to secure this in place. Then we're going to put some rivets on to make it look pretty. We're going to do the same for both sides. Okay, so I have sewn my strap connectors on and I have made a mark 1 inch up from the bottom and then 1 inch up from that. So there's 2 marks there, and I'm going to punch some holes and put some rivets in those marks. So this is where the rivet press comes in handy. You can obviously do this with hand tools as well. You don't have to have a rivet press. So that's 1 and 2. I'm using the medium rivets in the 9mm size. So I'm just gonna post those through and click them on. And I like to use the shank or the long post side, post it through from the right side, because I find that it pokes any like little excess pieces of foam or fabric that haven't been caught or cut out. It'll poke it through to the wrong side. If you're using fabric, this is when you want to fray check, but I'm not using fabric, so I don't need to fray check mine. So I'm now going to squish those into place, and then we can put these aside ready for the side pockets to be sewn on. So now that we have created these side panel pieces and I've squished my rivets on, and as I mentioned, the pattern would try and have you do this with half of this length, and I find that really fiddly to get it nice and neat. So this longer length of 5 inches by 1.5 inches I find so much easier to do. So we're going to put these to the side. You can just leave these as is. The next part, which is these side pockets, is optional. You don't have to put these on. I love these. I am going to put them on, but it is completely optional. So if you don't want to have these side pockets on your bag, you can leave this step out. So the first thing that we need to do is take our lining fabric and put it right side together with our outer fabric, and you're going to sew around this edge at 1/4 inch, and we're doing that because this is a curved edge that we're going to clip into with our pinking shears afterwards. So they have reduced the seam allowance just to make it easier for you to turn this under and press this later. So we're going to sew from this corner to this corner all along here at 1/4 inch, and you're going to do the same for both pieces. Now that I've sewn these at 1/4 inch, I then need to pink the edges. So I'm pinking this because this will help notch the curve so that when I turn it and press it and top stitch it, it won't be bulky and it should turn smoothly. This is one of my favorite tricks for clipping into curves that do need to be turned. You obviously want to cut close to, but not too close to your stitching, and all the way around. I'm going to do the same for both pieces. I then want to turn this around and bring the fabric to so that the wrong sides are together, and I'm going to lightly press this because obviously I'm working with a faux leather. I don't want to melt my vinyl, but I'm going to lightly press it, and then I'm going to top stitch this edge, and I'm going to use my top stitching length, which for me is 4.5. So I'm going to do the same, clip the curves on this one, turn them over, lightly press them, and top stitch that edge. So once you have top stitched the edge, you should end up with something that looks like this. Now you can baste all the way around the edges to secure the lining to the outer fabric. I'm being lazy. I don't recommend this. I recommend basting, but I, as I say, am being lazy. So I have clipped mine into place. So you want to basically take one of your side panels, move that one out of the way. You're going to put your pocket panel over the top. So you want to, and again, I'm trying to do this, let's turn you around that way a little bit. So we try and do this so you can see and I can see at the same time. So you want to center your panel, your pocket over your side panel, and you're going to start from the bottom middle, and you're going to pin or clip, in my case because wonder clips, because faux leather, and you're going to end up with your pocket kind of bowing up like this. When I did these at the retreat, we nicknamed these slippers. So you want to end up with something that you would be able to put your foot in, although it would be very uncomfortable because of the D-ring. So I'm going to clip this all the way around, and we're going to baste this into place again at 1/4 inch. And again, If you are worried about things getting out of alignment, baste your pocket first and then baste it to the side panel, but I'm skipping that step because I'm being lazy. So I'm going to get this all clipped into place, and then I will baste this onto the side panel at 1/4 of an inch all the way around, and I'm going to do the same for both sides. Now I have 2 slippers, so we can put these to the side, and we are going to need our main panel pieces and our long john connectors. I have my long johns, I've got my panel pieces. So you want to mark down 1.5 inches from the top edge, and it is the straight edge that does slant down. So you're going to mark 1.5 inches down from there, and then for the long johns I like to make a mark 1.5 inches in from the side, where 1.5 inch down, so 1.5 inches in, and I've done that for both sides. So I'm going to take my template for the screws, and I want to center that on the mark. So the top of the template is where the mark is. Again, I'm doing this on the side, so hopefully it works. Hopefully it's even. So we are going to use my friction pen to trace out the markings from the template, and just gonna, that does look straight. I'm gonna do the other one straight as well, just in case, and I'll put this back over those markings, just so that I can, so this is 1 3/4 away from the edge. So we want to make sure that this is all nice and straight. Okay. And we're going to do the same for both of the panels. And again, 1.5 inches down, 1.5 inches in, center that, 1 3/4 away from the edge. So we're drawing in all 6 of the little holes that come on the template or the backing plate for the long johns. So the long john connector itself, as we've seen, has got 6 holes in the backing plate. The center hole is for the screw, and the other 2 are prongs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my rivet press with the cutting tool in it, and I'm going to cut holes in the center of the markings, and then I'm going to use my awl to poke through the top and bottom markings either side of the screw hole. That will just give these little prongs somewhere to burrow into the fabric to help catch the back plate when we then use the screws to attach it. So I'm going to go and cut holes in all of these pieces, the center hole only, and then make all holes for the top and the bottom holes. If you are using fabric, this is when you want to fray check after cutting in the holes. Okay, so I've used my rivet press to punch holes for the screws, and I'm using my awl to make sure that all of the foam and stuff is out of the way. And then, as mentioned, I'm going to use my awl to poke holes either side, and that will just give those prongs on the long johns somewhere to sit. So I'm going to do that for all 4 long john connectors, so 16 pieces in total, and I will then come back and show you how I attach the long johns. You want to take one of your little screws, and again, be really careful with your screws, you do not want to lose them. In fact, we're going to need our duct tape in a minute, so I'm going to use my duct tape as my screw corral. I'm going to take one of my screws out. So I'm going to take the backing plate, poke the screw through the center hole, and then poke that, and this is where the awl is nice and helpful. Get rid of any of the extra fuzz that the rivet press didn't quite cut through. There we go. Right, so take the screw through the backing plate, through the center hole until it comes out the right side. Just about see that there. And you can take your long john, and this is kind of trial and error. You want to aim your long john out your screw and screw it into place. And that has not quite worked. There we go. And you don't want to secure it 100%, you just want it to bite a little bit so that it holds the long john on, because you're going to then take your second screw, and again, they're in the screw corral, fingers crossed I don't lose one. Take your second screw and you're going to do the same thing. You're going to put it through the center hole of the backing plate, through the hole in the fabric, and kind of try and aim it at the hole in the long john connector. I've caught it. So now that I've caught both screws, I'm going to tighten those up so they're nice and secure. And that's my first long john on. So I'm going to repeat the process. Once I have done, or I was going to move my screw corral, that would have been silly. Once that's all done, you're then going to take your duct tape and put duct tape over your backing plates, and that's just going to stop these screw ends rubbing on your lining fabric and rubbing holes in your lining fabric. So I'm going to get the rest of these on, and then I will show you what that looks like. All the screws are in, as mentioned. Putting on the duct tape, and you want to keep it out of the seam allowance, so you want to make sure it's kind of leaning towards the middle. And make sure that it doesn't touch itself, because duct tape sticks to nothing better than other duct tape. Again, ask me how I know. So we're going to do the same for the other side, and then we can work on the base. So we're going to get our bottom panel piece and our bottom support. I'm going to turn this over, and then I am going to draw in the seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch all the way around. Okay, so now that my seam allowance is drawn in, I'm going to take my bottom panel, which should fit perfectly into that seam allowance, and I just need to trim a little bit off this side. I've cut it slightly too large, but again, better slightly too large than slightly too small. So I just need to trim 1/4 inch off this side. But once I have got it to the right size, I'm then going to go and fuse this into place. Okay, so we want to mark on our feet placement for our base. This is again an extra addition that the pattern doesn't include. I just really like purse feet. I mean, I really like bag bling in general. I am marking in 1 inch from each edge on the corners, and this is from the base support, not from the edge of the fabric. So this will be the position of my first 4 feet, and then I want to mark the center point of my base, which is 11 inches wide, so 5.5 inches is the middle, and then 1 inch in, and I'm going to do the same for both sides. Now I'm not going to install my feet quite yet, because it'll be easier to sew this base panel into place without the feet installed. The feet are really easy to install, especially now that I've put these markings in. So the next thing that we want to do is take one of our front panels, and we're going to line up the base panel with the raw edge right sides together, clip this into place, and you're going to sew at 1/2 inch all the way along, and you're going to repeat for the other side. And again, use your wonder clips if you're using faux leather, because you don't want to pierce your leather with pins. So you should end up with something that looks like this. So the next thing that we need to do is a line of top stitching along the base piece, and we want to top stitch all of the seam allowance to the base piece. So I am going to use my edge stitch foot to get that done. I'm going to use my top stitching length for the faux leather, which for me is 4.5. The important thing is, as I say, is to make sure that all the seam allowance is being sewn to the base piece. So I'm going to get that done, then we can install our feet. Okay, so as you can see, my seam allowance has been top stitched onto the base pieces. So I'm going to take my awl and poke my holes for my purse feet. And again, if you're using fabric, this is when you want to use your fray check. So you want to take one of your purse feet and you're going to post it through that hole. And I'm going to take the backing plate and you want to open up the legs of your feet and fold them back on themselves. And you're going to repeat that 5 more times, and then we are going to put duct tape over those so that again these metal pieces do not rub on our lining once we've installed that. You should end up with something that looks like this, but again with this you are being careful to keep the tape out of your seam allowance because you really don't want to sew over this when you are stitching on the side panels because it will gunk up your needle. And from the right side you should have something that looks like this. So next thing we need to do is find the center of our bottom panel, which is 4.5 inches wide, which means it's going to be the 2.25 inch mark. I'm going to do that for both sides. And we also want to find the center of our slippers as they have been christened, and we are going to sew these on the same way that we sewed our lining pieces. So you want to match up the center point of your slipper with the center point of the base, pin that, or pin and clip that into place. Then you're going to clip the upper part into place, and then you're going to ease in the curves, and we're going to sew this at 1/2 inch. If you find that you're struggling with this around, especially around the curves, you can staple these into place within the seam allowance, making sure that you keep very far away from the actual stitching line so that if you do have staples in it you won't be anywhere near sewing through or around a staple. But staples will obviously hold this much more securely than wonder clips, especially given that you need to manhandle this quite significantly to get it under the presser foot in these corner areas. So if you are having trouble, staples are a solution for that. And we are going to be trimming off this excess seam allowance around this basting line. We're going to use the basting line here as our guide for what we're going to trim off later. So you want to aim to keep your staples within the excess seam allowance that you will be trimming off. So I'm going to get this pinned into place and sewn at 1/2 inch, and then repeat on the other side. After a lot of wrangling, you should end up with something that looks like this. Now, I raised up my sewing machine. I'm not sure that helped any, but it was something to try and sort of like squish this under so I could get it sewn without hitting it or getting any kinks or tucks or puckers in it. The other thing that I did was I sewed it in passes. So I sewed from here to here and backstitched, kind of rearranged, then sewed around the bottom edge to about here and backstitched, rearranged, and then sewed from there all the way up to the top and backstitched. So I did do this in 3 passes for each side, and that just helped me to kind of make sure that I wasn't catching anything that I shouldn't or getting any kind of tucks or puckers in it. So now that this is sewn, we want to trim the seam allowance down. The pattern does say to 1/8 inch, but I'm going to trim it down to 1/4 inch, and that is where those basting stitching lines that we did earlier come into play, because they are 1/4 inch away from the raw edge. So you basically want to trim along those basting lines and trim off all the excess so that when we turn this through you get nice corners and curves. So now all the excess seam allowance has been trimmed away, you want to turn your bag the right way out. You are going to have to kind of squish and pull, so you want to kind of be as gentle as you can, but I mean that's one of the nice things about foam, it's kind of forgiving. Yes, turn it through. Desperately trying not to break a nail during this project. Make sure that the kind of curves are being turned through nicely, and you should end up with something that looks like this. Yeah, pleased with that. Got a little bit of a small pucker there, but again, if you've got anything like that, just kind of like work at it. I know, just, you know, get your knuckles in. Okay. So it's all nicely turned through, and we have our bag outer ready to be put into our bag lining, which is the next step. Before we actually put it in though, I am going to mark on my V points, the side points here, my seam allowance, so that I have a guide. And the seam allowance for the top edge is 1/4 inch. So I'm marking in the seam allowance, there we go, on there, and that's just so that I have something to aim at when I am stitching the top edge into place. I'm going to do the same on the outer as well as the lining piece. I'm going to mark on these bits here my 1/4 inch seam allowance so that I have something to aim at. I find it easier to pin one side at a time, or clip one side at a time. The reason that we're working one side at a time is so that you can kind of manipulate the bag. I find it really difficult to sew the whole way around in one go. Sew in one side, backstitch at the beginning and the end, take the work out, re-clip, repin, and do the other side. And again, I'll show you that as we go. Okay, so I have my outer bag inside my lining, right sides together, and I have only clipped together the one side because we are going to sew from the V where we're going to backstitch around to the other V where we're going to backstitch, because we do need to clip into this V, so we want to reinforce this area. Because the lining is smaller than the outer, I find it easier to clip one side, because as you can see, this really does not want to behave. So I've got the free arm of my machine out so that I can kind of put that inside of the bag, as it were, like this. And again, if you find it easier to sew this first pass here and backstitch at this point and then readjust the bag, that's totally fine. It doesn't matter how many passes you do this in, as long as you maintain the even seam allowance, which is for this part 1/4 inch. So I'm going to get this side sewn, then I will get the other side sewn, and I will show you what that looks like when we're done. So that's the first side done. So I'm now going to get the second side clipped and sewn. I'm going to make sure that I'm reinforcing these corners here, or these points here, because as I say, we need to clip to that sewn point there to make sure that the bag will turn through. So I'm going to get this side clipped into place and sewn, then we can start turning our bag through. It is sewn, it's ready to be turned through. First things first though, as I mentioned, we need to clip to those points, and you're clipping through your lining and your outer fabric. So this bit is terrifying. Do not clip through your stitching. Make sure you do not clip through your stitching. Okay, so remember the cat flap earlier? This is where we're going to pull the elephant through. This is something that I learnt from the very lovely Erica from Lavender and Twine, that birthing your bag is a lot easier through the side of your lining rather than the tiny little end of your zipper pocket. I mean, it doesn't look beautiful, but like, how easy was that? So, turn it all the way through, push the lining inside, and make sure you're happy with how everything is looking. And you're probably going to have to kind of reach in and mold things a little bit, because the next stage is to top stitch this edge. Now with a all fabric bag, you definitely want to press that. With a bag like this with the fabric lining, I can give this a gentle press from this side to make sure that everything is sitting where I want it to. But I am going to give this, like, sort of like roll this out, finger press it, give it a light press with my iron, then I'm going to clip it into place and I'm going to top stitch. I'm going to do it top stitching the same way that we sewed the lining to the outer. I'm going to start at the V and I'm going to top stitch all the way around around to the other V. I'm going to leave a long thread tail both ends so that I can thread those long thread tails back through and tie a knot to finish it so that there isn't a lot of visible back stitching. Once I've done one side, I'm going to turn everything over and repeat for the other side. Then we can sew up the lining. My edges are all top stitched and I have left myself some long thread tails. So I am going to thread those onto my needle and post the thread through to the interior of the bag, and I'm going to do it from the exterior and from the lining because we want this to be in the wrong side of the fabric, and then tie those in knots. We're nearly done, but we still have the gaping hole in our lining. So you want to open up the interior zipper pocket, and you're going to reach through the interior zipper pocket, and you're going to grab your lining and you're going to pull it back through the interior zipper pocket. You're going to pull it out as much as you possibly can. Now, you remember earlier when we stitched this with a basting stitch, pressed it and then opened it back up? That will give us a little crease and memory of where we need to sew. So you're going to pin this back together and sew this at 5/8 of an inch. Remember, our lining is slightly smaller than the bag, so we're going to start backstitch where the hole starts, stitch all the way around to the other side at 5/8 of an inch. My cat flap is all sewn up, so I'm going to feed that back through into the bag. So the last thing to do for the lining is to pull out the zipper pocket, match up the folded edges and top stitch that into place, and then the bag lining is complete. I can then put my zipper pull on, finish off the zipper tape with the zipper tab, and then put on the handles, which I will of course show you. I have put on my little zipper cap. I'm not going to talk you through the instructions for this because this comes from a separate pattern, the Rivets bag by Lavender and Twine. I highly recommend that pattern. I have made it once, I'm planning on making it again. The instructions for this little zipper cap come with that pattern. That's why I am not going to give them away, the measurements away for this one, because it is a paid for pattern from another company. So I would highly suggest you get the Rivets because it's a gorgeous bag, so well written. There is already a sew along included in the pattern as well, so highly worth the price tag. That's where I got this zipper cap pattern piece and method from, and I highly recommend it. You can also use the metal zipper caps that come from Emmeline bags and other sources as well to finish off the end of your zip. I just like to tuck mine inside my bag. So I'm going to put this to the side for now, and we're going to finish off our handles. So I'm just going to tip you down and let's get that done. You're going to need your handles. Don't worry if they curl like this. You can, if you've made them at the beginning, you can leave them under a heavy box to help straighten them out, but when you actually use your bag they will be straightened out naturally just by use. We're going to take the handle and we're going to draw a line 3 inches in from the raw edge, and you're doing this on the wrong side of your handle if you do have a right and wrong side, and you're going to do that on both ends and on both handles. Next thing we're going to do is mark a dot in the center of our handle, which for me is 3/4 of an inch, so that would be 3/8 of an inch, and then it's also going to be 3/4 of an inch away from the raw edge. So this is 3/4 of an inch away from the raw edge and centered, so for me that's 3/8 of an inch. And you're going to use your hole punch to punch a hole. You then want to fold over the raw edge to meet that 3-inch mark that you made earlier. You're going to use the hole that you've just punched as a guideline for punching your second hole. Okay, and you're going to repeat that step for all 4 ends of your 2 handles. Now I've got this one done, I'm going to repeat it for this side. So 3/4 of an inch in from the edge and centered, so that's 3/8 of an inch. Punch a hole. Fold your strap over to meet the 3-inch mark that you made earlier. Use the hole that you've just punched as a guide to mark where your second hole goes, and punch. And I'm going to do the same for the other handle as well. Once you've done that, you then want to attach your handle to your bag, and this one handle is going to go on this side of the bag. Don't put it like one side to the other side, that's wrong. It's going to go, one handle is going to go attached to the one side of the bag. I like to have my doubled edge, so I've got my folded edge as my right side, and then the edge where you've sewn it together, I like that to be on the interior. So you're going to post your handle through your strap anchor, take your rivet, post the rivet through the holes, put on the backing, and then squash that into place. And then you're going to do the same. Make sure you don't get your handle twisted, and you're going to do the same for the other side. So I've made sure that my handle isn't twisted. It's nice and flat. I'm going to squish those rivets so that they're set, and then we can put on the strap ends, and obviously you need to do this for both sides. So I'm going to get it done and then I'll show you the finished bag. Once you've put on your strap ends and attached your shoulder strap, then your bag is done. One final thing to do. Let's hope this is successful. Oh, it's always so satisfying when you get to peel the little plasticky bits off of the hardware. So satisfying. I absolutely love how this one's turned out. This is a remake of one that I made earlier this year. I added the recessed zip to this one because I much prefer the sewing experience finishing this bag off. The other ones that I have made have all had the zip that goes in along the top. Battery's dying, 2 secs. That's better. So yes, I have made 6 of these now, and one nearly identical to this earlier on this year, but the previous 5 have all had the zip that went in along the top edge there. I have to say the sewing experience is not my favourite. This way round of doing things is much less stressful, and I found much easier to get a nice finish on my bag. So I'm very happy with this one. I hope you like the tutorial of how to put this together. The changes that I have made will work for the larger commuter tote as well, but you do need to bear in mind that the gaps at the top of the commuter tote will be a lot larger, so that is something to bear in mind. If that will bug you, then you might want to consider putting it in the zip the regular way. But I have to say I do like this recess zip, and it has made this a much more pleasant sewing experience. I love the little domed feet, I love the hardware. This just really makes me very happy. My niece is getting my earlier version of this, and I'm going to keep this one. So Ree, if you ever watch this, I hope you are enjoying your bag. But yeah, I love the Annette. I think it's a really fantastic pattern. I think it shows off prints really well. I mean, obviously I've gone for all over faux leather, but if you this area here is great for showing off pretty prints or fussy cutting, as Mum did with the fabric that you saw in the cutting guide. So yeah, love this bag, very happy with it. The only change that I've made to the inside is the little elasticated pocket. I added that in because Mum wanted more pockets on the inside of her bag. You can use Pocket A supplement from Chris W Designs. It just fits in. It is a bit of a squeeze, so do bear that in mind. But I have found that the elasticated pocket and the zipper pocket internally are enough for me. I hope you've enjoyed the sew along for this. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!